Okay, thanks everyone for coming out for the session this morning. My name is Mauricio Ordonez, and this is the first of our series of talks on what we've been doing with workflow in SharePoint 2013. So for today's session, I'm going to be talking a little bit, give you an overview of some of the things that are new in SharePoint 2013 workflow, and then after that, the session's the title of the session is on architecture and configuration. So once we do the overview, we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper, go into the architecture of the new workflow model, and then we're also going to talk about some deployment topics and how you actually configure. So with that, let's first just do some review of. I'm going to try to get out from under the screens here. Let's just do a little bit of overview of what we're trying to accomplish with workflow. So when we started the 2013 release, we really thought about the three main themes for workflow. One was we wanted to make workflows in SharePoint Designer, declarative workflows, more expressive. We wanted you to be able to go further with your workflow logic before you had to go into something more advanced like Visual Studio. And so we know in many cases you just couldn't write the kind of logic that you wanted in SharePoint Designer because you just didn't have the necessary flow control. So that was a big goal for us. The second is, as you heard from the keynote and have probably seen in some of the other sessions, we're introducing a new cloud app model for SharePoint. And a big part of what we were doing with workflow is make sure that workflow was aligned with the app model. And so we have alignment of workflow in really two ways. We have one where workflows are a major component of how you build apps in SharePoint, because workflows provide an engine for running declarative logic in your apps. And the other thing is workflow is also a consumer of the app model. We actually use the app model to build workflow in SharePoint. So we're essentially one of our main internal customers of the app model. And then finally, in the spirit of the new app model, where we are taking solutions built on SharePoint to a more loosely coupled model, so that it can run, so that solutions can run equally well on-prem and on the cloud. We've also done that with workflow, where we now have workflow processing executing outside of the core SharePoint web server process. So we're going to talk about that in the architecture. So when we talk about workflow in SharePoint, workflow is a very, in the most general sense, people use the term workflow to talk about just how people do their work. But in SharePoint, when we talk about workflow, we mean something very specific. We actually are talking about human-centric, people-centric workflows. And these things manifest themselves as workflows that advance because a person takes some action. And that action could be submitting a document, or it could also be completing a task related to some piece of work. So that might be if I have a design document that I want to review and approve, that would be a very classic SharePoint workflow. And we can have workflows with any kind of list content, be it list items or also document libraries. And then we also have site workflows, which aren't associated with any one particular item, but are associated with the site itself. And then, as I was saying earlier, we think of workflows as really the business logic in the solution, which has several important properties that the workflow brings. One is that workflows are declarative. So these are solutions that are built without traditional code. There's no compiled assemblies in the workflow, which has this nice property that we can execute them in a safe manner. So we know that there's from a security perspective, the code is the logic is more like data than code. The other aspect of workflow is that they're long running. So we can have workflows that can run in a matter of a few seconds, so they just execute and complete. But workflows can also run for hours, days, weeks, months, and one of the strengths of the workflow engine is that it can take that workflow that's been executing and take it out of memory, persist it to disk. It's stored in a database durably, and then when it's time for the workflow to wake up, the engine will restore the workflow from disk, execute it till it reaches the next idle point, and then persist the workflow back on disk. So the advantage is you can have lots and lots of workflows running, and when they're not running, they're not consuming any system resources other than the disk space for storing the state. And finally, workflows have a property that they tend to be event-driven. So generally, workflows advance as a result of some action. That action could be a new document, or it could also be workflow creates a task, and then that task gets completed, and then the workflow resumes based off of that event. So we'll see how we use these properties of workflows to construct solutions and incorporate them into apps. Okay, I'm going to switch over here and start with a short demo. See if this works. Maybe not. Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah, it's unplugged. Okay. Okay, so in this scenario, what I have is, let's say I'm Alex, and I have a technical specification that I want that I'm going to submit for review, and we're going to use a workflow that's going to walk us through the review and approval process of this specification. So I'm going to just go ahead and drag and drop. I have a few that are already in progress. I'm going to go ahead and drop a new one into my list. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, there we go. It's uploading. It's just, I think as everybody knows, network is a little bit slow. So we get to see the nice drag and drop feature in SharePoint. Okay, so now we've submitted that document. And what you'll notice is that we have this column here, which is the design document review. This is the name of our workflow. And we see that we already have some that are in progress. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh. And you can see that now that there's been a new status that has been updated to that on that document, which is that that document is ready for review. And what's happened behind the scenes is that a workflow is kicked off. We've associated the workflow with this document library, and that workflow has kicked off, and it's done a few things. One of the things that it has done is it's created a few tasks for approval. So I'm going to switch over to a different browser, and I'm going to be one of the managers on the team, Dennis, and Dennis is going to go to his go to his My site and look in his My Task site, and that's where he can see all the work that he has pending. So I'm going to refresh Dennis's view, and you can see that now in his My Task view he sees that he has a new task, which is to review the specification that I just uploaded. Now, if you're familiar with how tasks work in the previous version of SharePoint, workflows create tasks on a task list. And it was very common to have, basically to make it easy for people that are looking at tasks to have one very large task list so that you wouldn't have to go to 10 different sites in order to see all your workflows. Now, because we have this new great task aggregation service, you actually can split your projects down to smaller sites that are more focused on the specific scenario, and let the task aggregation service pull tasks from all the sites in SharePoint and give you one view, and that view can also show a time. You can have a list view. You can also have a timeline view. So here we see that same task displayed in the timeline view, and Dennis can use that in order to plan his work. So I'm going to go ahead and open the task. And here you can see in the task, we have our newly rendered task forms. It shows the different task outcomes that I can select, approved or rejected. And one of the things that we've done is made it so that it's very easy to customize the task outcomes. So you could select your own in addition to approved and rejected. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to approve the task. So here I've signaled that I've reviewed the document and it's complete. So when I switch back to my view, I can refresh. And you can see now that the workflow is advanced. What it's done is, at this point, that workflow has assigned another task back to Alex saying that, waiting for him to get the document to the next stage, which is submitted for final review. So there you go. That was, so we just ran a workflow. So another nice attribute of how we now track workflow status is that the workflow status is just a regular field in SharePoint. So you could, well, here they're all the same, but I could easily sort by it and filter and do all the great things that I can do with SharePoint fields. I can export the data and then be able to look at all the workflow status across all my lists. So this is something that I know many of you that have done workflow had wanted to do before. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's take a look at that workflow. So let me just start by say, if I wanted to start creating that workflow, I go into SharePoint Designer, which is our workflow design environment, and I can go and select a list workflow, and go into, and this is a workflow in my documents library. So I go ahead and select the documents list. And one of the things that you'll notice is that we have two platform types. So we have SharePoint 2010 workflow and SharePoint 2013 workflow. The SharePoint 2010 workflow is our classic workflow engine that we've always had. And then the 2013 workflow is the new workflow engine that we'll be talking about for the remainder of the session. And when you start designing, if you want to use some of the features that we have in the new model, that's where you would make a selection as to which platform type you want. So I'm going to select 2013, and I'll just say demo 1, 2, 3. And so the first thing that you'll notice that's different is that you see that we create a stage for you. And this is a new construct that we've introduced in SharePoint Workflow. A stage we think of as a basic unit of tracking progress of a workflow. When most of us think of a process, we think about things being in various stages along the way. And so we've taken that concept and we've actually made that something that we support inherently in the workflow. So in here I can give the stage a title, so I can say ready for review, and I can go ahead and add additional stages. So I'm just going to insert a few more stages, and you can see that you'd start building your workflow that way. The other interesting thing about the stage is that we have this notion of a transition. So in the transition, I can do some of that flow control that I was talking about earlier. So those of you familiar with the previous version of with the classic workflow, you saw that most workflows were sequential, so they execute in a linear fashion. But I'm guessing most processes are not sequential. Most processes have different exception conditions, or you might want to restart part of that process. So this was one of those cases where before, if you had a workflow where you needed to do something like go back in a process, you had to go to Visual Studio and write a code workflow. But now, what we can do is we can do something that is brand new. So we have go-to. So now in SharePoint Designer, I can write go-tos with workflow. And I can use that to have that process go back. So there we go, first clap. So other things that I could do is like in the transition stage, I can also make that go-to be conditional. So for instance, let me just get rid of this guy. So let's say that I had done a task process. So I'm going to say start a task process. When I do this, it makes a network call, so it takes a little bit. So in that task process, this is what my workflow is doing. I'm going to say that I want this task process to be parallel, and I'm going to select a few people. So let's say I select 3 people that are part of my task process. I'm just going to put a title. So now in the task options, it's very easy for me to say what the task completion conditions are. I can say wait for all responses, wait for the first. So in the workflow that I had done, I have actually multiple approvers, and I've selected so that I only needed the first response. And so that's when Dennis completed that task, that's when the workflow advanced, because I had set this condition to just be the first response. Anyway, you can select other things like emails, customize the email. And then the other thing you can do is you can also now customize easily the task outcome. So you saw that we could select approve and rejected, and that's our default task outcome. But that's just a choice field, a choice content type in SharePoint. And so you can customize the choice content type and select your own task outcomes. And in this dropdown is where you would select that content type. Okay, so now let me switch over here where I've basically have the workflow, the same workflow that I was running. You can see that we can use the outcome condition to direct the transition of the workflow. So we can use this to now start constructing our business process. Now, this is the text view for designing workflow in SharePoint. It's pretty nice if you want to be able to write, have a condensed view of a lot of logic. But sometimes I know it's especially with a workflow, it's useful to be able to see a visual representation of a workflow. So you want to see it not just as a text mode, but you want to be able to communicate what the process is doing. So what you actually want is you want to have a diagram of what the workflow is doing. So one of the things that's new is we now have in SharePoint Designer a visual editor for workflow. And so this visual designer lets me do everything that I can do inside the text editor. So here's that same task process. I can look at the process settings, and we have the same capability that I have in the text designer. I can have a full editing fidelity in the visual designer. I can change it here, switch back to text, and continue working. The other thing that's great is, this is the full workflow. So I can see it with all the details. But sometimes if I'm designing a workflow and I want to communicate with a business analyst, what I actually want is I want maybe a more condensed view of the workflow. The thing that I really care about are the stages, which describe the process and the transitions between stages and the flow between stages. Because for most business analysts, that's really kind of at the level that you want to think about a process. So in addition to this detailed view, we also have this ability to generate a stage outline. So and I have here one that I've generated. You can see this is a much more condensed view of the workflow. And what this allows me to do is I can export the stage outline to Visio, and then I can do all sorts of annotation just using standard Visio. And I can use that as a way of collaborating between the workflow designer and the business analyst. And if we're going to go in details in terms of how the two designers work. We have a session that's being done by Sam Chung and H.G. Kim. They're going to go into detail into both of these design experiences. Okay. So now let's talk about what we're seeing. So just to recap, in terms of when we talk about making workflows more expressive, Really, stages and transitions were a big part of that. We can write these more expressive workflows directly in SharePoint Designer. And these workflows, with all their logic, the go-tos and looping, these workflows will run both in SharePoint Server on premises and also in SharePoint Online in the cloud. So now you don't have to make any compromises when you're thinking about workflow and some of the trade-offs that you would have for not enabling Visual Studio workflows in SharePoint Online. Because we've made declarative workflows a lot more powerful, now you can take those same workflows to the cloud. The other thing I showed you is our more modular task process, where we have simpler task processes that you can use the more expressive flow control to combine together, so that you can build the process that you want from these modular pieces. And then Visual Designer again helps with communication. And one thing that I didn't show, but we'll talk about, is we also have the ability from a SharePoint 2013 workflow to invoke one of our classic workflows. And this is a great use, for instance, if you have some either existing workflows or existing actions that you built in the previous workflow platform, and you want to reuse in the new workflow engine, you can use our ability to compose one of those workflows or actions in the new engine. And then we also have some improvements in the parallel block where you can easily terminate branches. So let's look architecturally. What's going on? What's new in the engine that makes this possible? So starting with, and I apologize that I have to be behind the tall screens, but somebody walked away with the remote, so I have to click the mouse. So let's talk about architecturally what's going on. So in SharePoint, SharePoint strengths are around people, content, sharing, and we've always had, since 2007, since SharePoint 2007, a workflow engine that was part of SharePoint. And that workflow engine can execute in one of two places depending on the stage of the workflow. It can either execute on the web front end along with your page rendering, or it can run in the timer service. And so we call that kind of the classic engine. The thing that is new in 2013 is that we're introducing a brand new server as well as a service in the cloud from Microsoft. And this service is called the Workflow Manager. The Workflow Manager is where all the workflows that I was running are executing. It's something that we worked in conjunction with the workflow team in .NET in Azure. Actually, Scott Guthrie's team is responsible for Workflow Manager. And what we've done is we've integrated that into SharePoint. And I'll go into details in terms of some of the benefits that we get from the Workflow Manager. But first and foremost, Workflow Manager has been built from the ground up to be able to process purely declarative workflows. It has a pure declarative model, which is why we're able to go so far with declarative workflows. The other thing that it has is, because it's a separate server, you can scale it and manage it independently. So this, using this loosely coupled model, we now have a lot more control in terms of where workflows execute. And because workflows don't have to execute on the same process as the web front end, it reduces some of the memory and CPU pressure that workflows might otherwise put on your SharePoint core. So the net result is that end users get faster responsiveness for web pages, but then workflows will execute on this separate layer where they can be more scalable, more manageable. So Workflow Manager itself uses some other components as part of the overall solution. And one of them is the Service Bus. The Service Bus is a messaging platform that we've had running in Azure for a while. So, we typically see Microsoft Server technologies move from server to the cloud. Service Bus is actually the opposite. It's a technology that we've been running in the cloud for some time, and we're actually moving that also to the server environment. And the advantage of Service Bus, Workflow uses Service Bus as its core state management and messaging layer. Because in this new model, this new loosely coupled model, all communications between SharePoint and workflow were all message-based. And so we use the capabilities of the service bus for reliable message delivery. It's a message broker, and it's also the thing that keeps the message state as well as the instance state synchronized, or consistent, I should say. So how do you actually connect Workflow Manager to SharePoint? Is through an integration layer, which we call the Workflow Services Manager. And the Workflow Services Manager is a new, it's both a new object model that's part of SharePoint, as well as a new service application proxy. So if you go in SharePoint Central Admin and you take a look at managing service applications, you will see this new Workflow Service Application Proxy, which is how we connect into the Workflow Manager. In order to connect, we also require a client component. And the Workflow Manager client is a component that has to be running wherever SharePoint is running. And this is really the only piece that actually has to be physically on the SharePoint box. Now, it is possible to put Workflow Manager, Service Bus, Workflow Client, and SharePoint all in the same machine. In fact, that's quite common. But if you were to separate those, and if you were interested in having your own set of dedicated machines to just running workflow, then you, at a minimum, would need the Workflow Client on the SharePoint machine. So as I was saying, between SharePoint and the Workflow Manager, everything is message-based. So we now have a well-defined contract for events and management operations happening from SharePoint into the Workflow Manager, and that's done through a series of REST HTTP calls. And so inside the Workflow Manager, one of the things that we've done is we've made the Workflow Manager something that we use it to build the workflow UI, both in SharePoint and SharePoint Designer, but it's also something that's publicly available for apps. So we envision a world where there'll be many different kinds of tailored workflow design experiences, and we've built Workflow Manager so that it really exposes the full power of workflow to apps. And this is where where you're seeing already some apps in the marketplace that are building workflow designers. This is the main entry point into SharePoint for being able to build workflows using the new engine. So the deployment service is a set of classes that let you take a workflow definition and publish it and associate it with SharePoint. So this is basically the main, where you take a main workflow and you deploy it and really connect it to SharePoint. We also take events that are occurring in SharePoint. So as a result of documents on a list, documents getting added to a list, or tasks getting completed, and those events are sent via our messaging objects into the Workflow Manager. And this messaging capability is also exposed to apps, so apps can have custom messages. So as an example, you could define from an external application a custom message that you want to send into a workflow. And you can have a workflow that also subscribes to that message and waits for a notification. Underneath, we'll set up a set of activation rules so that when that message comes into SharePoint, it can be routed and delivered to that workflow instance. And that's again using some of the power of the service bus to set up an activation rule in the service bus so that now the workflow can rendezvous with that message. We also have an instance service that lets you query for instances and also manage them. So you can use the instance service, for instance, if you wanted to, say, terminate an instance or see additional information. We provide some debug traces and other kinds of useful information about instances. You can see related tasks and things of that nature. And then finally, we have the interop service. And the interop service is what allows us to invoke a 2010 workflow. And then completing the callbacks from Workflow Manager to SharePoint. This is where Workflow Manager uses our new REST endpoints to do all of its operations on SharePoint. So when I was saying that workflow is not just a component of the app model, a service available to apps, but also one of the main customers of the app model, what we actually have is, going through our app model API, we have workflows essentially using those same set of services in order to do their work. And all of this is secured via the OAuth security model. There's going to be some, if you want to understand more about that, we're not going to go into a lot of details in terms of how OAuth works, although we'll talk a little bit about authorization, but we're going to have some other talks in the conference that go in more detail about how authorization works. But I think the key takeaway here is, again, this is all connected with the app model. And as I mentioned, we have SharePoint Designer as our declarative design environment. And you can also use Visual Studio to create these declarative workflows, which I'm going to show you later as well. This question. Yeah, so the question is, if we have a multiple workflow manager service, is it possible to scale out? So the answer is yes, it is possible. I'm going to talk a little bit later on in terms of how things scale, but yeah, it's actually been designed, to scale, both up and out. Okay, so we've done all this work in the workflow manager to make declarative workflows be really enabled to call web services. So you saw in the diagram, all workflow updates to SharePoint are done through REST web services. So wouldn't it be great if you as workflow developers could also use that same ability to connect to external data in your workflows? I think that would be pretty awesome. Let's see how we do that. Okay, so I'm back in my engineering company's website or SharePoint site, and in this case we have a number of job sites around the world that we're running. And what I want to do is I want to set up a page where I'm actually calling a web service that gives me access to weather information for each one of those cities. So in this case, we have one that's already running. Not sure why we're not getting the, oh, there we go. So we still have network glitches. So anyway, yeah, this is, so here's one that I've already set up. But let me go ahead and add some additional cities where we have projects going. So I'm just going to copy and paste in here into our list. Okay, so and you can see as the cities get pasted, you can see that I've pasted a whole set of cities in our nice new grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say stop editing. And there we go. You can see that now we actually have a workflow that's in the background called a web service that gives me weather information for all those cities. And you can see that those were kicked off right away. I'm just going to refresh to finish rendering the page. You can see now we have weather information for all those cities. So there we go. So we call the web service. Now, you may have seen that all of those workflows kicked off, as soon as I had updated the items. That's because in this new model, we're able to take the events. In this case, the events were that I created a new entry in that list, and we stream those events as they happen asynchronously into the workflow manager. And the workflow manager, as soon as it starts processing the events, as soon as those events come in. And so, unlike the previous version of workflow, where the events where workflows would either run synchronously on the web front end, or they would get delayed and run in a timer job, and the timer job would run in intervals of 5, 10, 15 minutes. Now we actually have a more timely processing of events because everything is built asynchronously, and we have a more streamed method of processing those events. What it allows me to do is it allows me to not have these peaks of activity every 10, 15 minutes that consume lots of resources. Instead, it allows me to amortize the cost of processing those workflows over time because the events are happening the events are getting processed as soon as they come in. And then, if I were to get a big burst, then of course, throttling will kick in. Okay, so let's take a look at how we built this workflow. So that workflow is actually calling. I have this is web service that I found, where I can construct a query, pass in the city name, and it gives me back this JSON data structure. So now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to call that web service, and then I'd like to be able to call that web service and then look for the weather information that I'm interested in. In this case, the temperature. So this is what make it easier for us to look at. I'm just going to use this JSON viewer, and let's say that we're looking at it. In this case, maximum temperature. So we have this data structure that's it's nested. It's quite quite complex. So how do we do this in SharePoint Designer? So I have my weather lookup workflow, which I've associated with that list, and we have this new action, which is calling an HTTP web service. And here I have that same URL. I have a parameter that represents the city, and we can see that it's a get method. So we have access to all the REST APIs. So I can do get, put, post, delete, and the result goes into this variable. And this variable is of type dictionary, and that's where the JSON from that web service is going to go. So then what I can do is we have another action, which is this get item from a dictionary action, which I've then used to essentially construct a path expression that lets me walk down that JSON data structure and pull out the value that I want. So we had looked at the maximum temperature, which is this line right here. We can see that it's doing data, weather. We have some arrays, and then a value inside an array. So let me see if I can put those side by side. And you can see, it's once you can, if you had multiple arrays and so forth, you can actually construct expressions to parse that data quite easily. So again, this is going to be covered in more detail on the talk on SharePoint Designer. But anyway, now what we've done is once we've extracted all the data that we want into variables, then we can go ahead and set the field item with some of those fields, the icon, and so forth. And then the other thing that we've done is, I don't want this to just run once, because we actually wanted to just be able to, I wanted to just be able to go to that page and see the weather, sort of the latest weather. So what I've actually done is I've made it so that this workflow runs once an hour, and once an hour it goes to that website and checks for the weather. So this is what I have with the one city that I had previously, where we can see that I'm going to go in the workflow status page. We're going to see that the workflow is logging every time that it's gone out to query the web service, and we can see that once an hour, every hour, the workflow runs, calls the web service, and updates my list.
What happens if the service application is restarted? Do you lose the workflow state?
So the question is, what happens if the service application is restarted? Do you lose the state? And the answer is you don't lose the state, because the workflows, everything in the workflow will be stored in the database. The state of the workflow is stored in the database. In fact, when the workflow is not running, so we said that run every hour, but when it's not running, it's actually stored in a SQL database, and it's been durably stored, and you can do disaster recovery and everything on those SQL databases. So you'll never lose the state of your workflow. That's when we talk about workflows being long running. That's exactly the attribute that we mean. They can be dormant for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, and you can restart. You can rebuild SharePoint, and then those workflows will still be stored in the database. Actually, I'm switching over here. Never mind. Okay, so that was pretty cool, calling web services from workflow. Again, that was another case where if you had wanted to do that kind of workflow before, you would have had to write some code in Visual Studio. But now we can do that from, directly from SharePoint Designer. So let's see, what's happening, one level below inside the workflow manager. And here we'll get into some of the questions of how things scale. So we have SharePoint, and we have the workflow manager. The workflow manager really consists of three major pieces. There's the back end, the service bus, and the front end. So all the processing for the workflow is happening on their back end. Typically, when the back end, front end, both of those are typically sit on the same machine in a server deployment. So in this case, this is the part of the workflow that was creating a task. We have our site users, and then we have our tasks, and we have our API in SharePoint. So let's see what happens when the workflow is running and it wants to create a task. So the first thing it's going to do is, over here on the right, you can see that we're going to look up a user as the first thing, and then we're going to go ahead and do some things to create the task item. So a note here is that we're going to look at how the consistency model works, and if some of you that have done a lot of workflows with 2010 know that in 2010 we had a consistency. Consistency is what is the state of the workflow versus what is the state in SharePoint. We had a model that we called batch updates, and then write on. We batch the updates and then we write them when the workflow reaches an idle point or when it wants to persist. And so I know, for instance, Nintex, they have an action which is commit all pending work, and what they're basically doing is they're forcing an update to SharePoint to happen. So I'm happy to say that that kind of thing won't be necessary going forward. So in this case, we're going to show how we use REST and OData, how we handle retry conditions, and how operations are, how we do everything in this repeatable style of operations to achieve consistency. So the first thing the workflow is going to do is it's going to look up a user. And here we just construct, in SharePoint, a standard REST get operation, which looks pretty much like what you see there, where we're looking up information in the site user info list, and we're looking on a specific user ID. And so we call the API endpoint, and then we get the data back in SharePoint. Now, this is because it's a get operation, and I'm only reading. When I say that operations are repeatable, what I mean is that those operations, I can run those operations all day, and I'm always going to get back the same information about the user. So in the case where, for whatever reason, there's the communication between the workflow backend and SharePoint is lost, one of the attributes of the workflow manager is that it'll retry that operation on behalf of the workflow. And you as a developer never have to think about this, but we always get asked, what happens if workflows can't talk to SharePoint? What happens to the state? So we have this retry built in. And so now, so let's say the operation succeeds, and now the workflow's happy. It goes on to the next phase. That works really well, as I said, in the case where I'm reading, when I'm always getting back the same data. But what happens what happens in the case where I actually need to change some data in SharePoint? In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a task. So I need to make sure that this is coordinated so that I can be sure that the task gets created, but also that I don't create duplicates, for instance, if something's timeout. So once again, we use the same concept of being able to retry our operations, and the first thing that we do is workflow persists to disk. In this point, we want to make sure that we've physically captured that we have durably captured the state of the workflow in the database. And so now at this point, we're ready to go ahead and start the update process in SharePoint. So the first operation we're going to do is we're going to reserve a task ID. This is what's going to uniquely identify that task. So that reserve operation, let's say it gives me back task ID number 1, and that's the ID that I'm going to use to create the task. And then if that succeeds, then we persist the state which has a task ID, and that way the workflow would continue. But now once again, let's say that for some reason, I'm not able to communicate with SharePoint. So I can keep trying the reserve operation. Maybe it timed out, and actually SharePoint thought it gave me task ID 1, but instead, but I lost it. It got lost in the communication along the way. So I retry, and I actually get task ID number 2. Well, from the point of view of SharePoint, no task has been created. All I've done is I've reserved a ticket that says nobody else will create task ID number 2. So that's the information that Workflow Manager will store along with the workflow instance. And so now when we get to the create, when we're actually going to create the task, again, we write the state. And then here, we're going to SharePoint and say, please create task ID number 2, along with all the other information of who it's assigned to. And then that operation either succeeds, in which case the workflow is happy and continues, or again, if we were once again in this mode where we can't connect, then it'll retry, and it'll retry until either it succeeds or SharePoint tells it, oh, I already have that task ID number 2. And once we detect that we have the duplicate, then we can go on our merry way. So anyway, so that's basically the style of the model that Workflow is using to keep consistent with SharePoint. And that's actually something that is probably for app developers when you're doing server-to-server calls to SharePoint using the new app model, and you want to compensate for loss of connectivity on the internet. That's probably a pattern that you would want to employ in your own SharePoint apps. Okay, so now let's look. So now the task has been created, and let's see what happens on the event side when we're waiting for the task to complete. So the next thing that Workflow will do is it'll tell, we do this operation that we call register interest, which basically we tell SharePoint, like, hey, when somebody makes a change to this task, I want to know about it. And then the other thing that we do is we then call one of the primitives inside the Workflow Manager called wait for notification. And at this point, wait for notification will essentially wait for a set of, it's basically going to put the workflow in idle mode so that the workflow is not going to go on any further until a set of conditions are met. And the notification conditions are actually evaluated down at the service bus layer. So it's at the service bus layer where we actually have put a bunch of rules on the message topic that say, when we get a message that has the following properties, where it's for task ID number 2, please wake up this instance. And it's that activation that is done down at where the service bus is going to be responsible for delivering that message to the right instance of the workflow. And the other thing is, for every update on the list, we only send one event. It doesn't, regardless of how many workflows might be listening on that task on the back end. So if we had 100 workflows that are all waiting for notification of a single item in SharePoint, we send one message, and the service bus has this capability, which they call publish and subscribe, where you can have hundreds of subscribers on a single message that all get activated in one shot. So now, in this case, Dennis updated the task. So through our messaging service, we're going to go and send the message. It goes to the workflow front end. The workflow front end writes it through to the service bus. And now the message, when the workflow front end gets confirmation that the message has been written in service bus, we basically tell SharePoint, yep, I have the message. Now at this point, that's when I updated the task. There's no workflow processing that's happened synchronously. All that we've done is we've told Workflow has told SharePoint, yep, I got the message. And now this is where then the loosely coupled processing in Workflow Manager kicks in, where the service bus is going to go ahead and look at its rules and figure out which workflow instance it needs to activate based on the notification subscriptions that had been created. So here, that workflow is going to get activated, and then once we reach the next point, then we basically write the state of the workflow, and then we receive the message, and then the message disappears from the database. So this is basically how we make sure that all the state in SharePoint is always kept consistent with the workflow state. Yes. So in the case of question was, in the case of backups, how do you handle backups because you have workflows in separate databases? So here's where you use standard database techniques where you actually do a checkpoint and you back up from a specific point. You basically do a point in time restore operation. So you have to put up do a checkpoint operation on the backup. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about authorization workflows as apps. I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit here. So in SharePoint 2010, we had this notion of workflows impersonating users, and workflows could impersonate either the initiator or the publisher through this action that we call the impersonation step. And these were unique to workflow. So that authorization model was really only supported by workflow. But now in SharePoint 2013, apps have identity. They have an identity that SharePoint understands. And as you'll see, because workflows themselves are apps, workflows also have an identity from the point of view of SharePoint. So let's see what we mean by that. I'm going to switch over back to the demo. And when we go, I was already at that page. I should have just left it. So when we go to site settings and we look at site app permissions, we can see all the different apps that have permissions to this site. And we can see one is SharePoint itself, but we also see down there that we have workflow and we have an app identifier. So all operations that the workflow is doing will be done using that identity. So in the case of my list, if I was going to go back and say, look at when I look at this item, you can see down there that it's been updated by workflow on behalf of Alex. So you can see that now, in addition to just having user modified by information, we have what is the app that modified that list item. So let's see how we use that combination of workflows having app identity and either having app identity or user identity together in a solution. So by default, workflows will make all updates as the application on behalf of user. We take both the app permissions as well as the user permissions, and we combine them together to determine whether the operation is going to be authorized or not. So both the app, both the workflow, as well as the user have to have access to that item that you're trying to update. So in this case, Alex and the workflow both had write permission on the list, and that's how that workflow was able to update. But there are many cases where the user is not going to have permissions on the list. So, for instance, you might have a case where what you're actually trying to use is you're trying to use a workflow to publish to a list that the users themselves cannot access. So how would you do that? The way that you would do that in workflow is you would basically wrap those operations in what we call the app step. And those operations are going to be done not with the app and the user's identity. Those operations will be done using only the identity of the workflow app itself. And so at that point, essentially the workflow is able to elevate permission beyond what the user is able to do by him or herself. So in this case, I have one simple workflow. Basically creates an item in the announcement, and one it just does it in the regular stage, and the other one is done inside of the app step. And the app step is one of the actions that we have available. It's this one. It's the app step. Normally it's disabled on a site. You have to have, and a site admin has to. Oh, good. Thank you. So the app step is something that you have to enable because it is an elevation of privilege. So we don't have it on by default. So let's see. Let's go back to our site, and go to our site settings. And if I go under Manage Site Features, you can see down there that we have workflows can use app permissions. In this case, I've activated it. If I deactivate it, then those operations aren't going to be allowed. In SharePoint Designer, you're not going to be able to insert app step. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the workflow. So those are site workflows that I have. So I'm going to go into my site workflows UI. I can see I've run it a few times already. I'm going to go ahead and run it one more time. Okay, now you can see that the workflow is started. I'm just going to go back to my announcements list. Okay, and we see that there are two new items that were just created. Those two new items in the title, I have one, I said created with app-only credentials and created with app and user credentials. So this was, let me see if I put this side by side. So, oops, sorry. So that first one, app and user credentials, corresponds to the outer one. App-only credentials correspond to the one inside the app step. So when I view this, you can see that this was created by workflow on behalf of Alex. And now, when we look at the one that was created with app-only credentials, it was created just by workflow. So what does this mean? What that means is that in the previous case, if Alex did not have access to that list, that operation would not be authorized. Even if the workflow did have access, even if the workflow app principal did have access to that list, because we actually do a logical AND operation of both sets of rights to determine the authorization. But in this case, because we're using only the app credentials of the workflow, what happens is we basically don't care who the user is. We just take the identity of the workflow, and we use that to make the authorization decision. Okay, I think we're on the home stretch. Okay, now I'm going to talk about workflows inside of apps. So SharePoint, we have various different app hosting models. One is cloud-hosted apps, which is what you saw at the keynote, where they can either be provider-hosted, which is in those cases where you have your SharePoint app and you have your own hosting environment, either in Azure that you provision yourself, or in your own app hosting provider of preference. Or you can also have us host it for you in Azure through the auto-hosted apps. So this is a case where we take care of provisioning the Azure environment for you and we deploy your application. But there's a third option that you see in Visual Studio, which are SharePoint-hosted apps. And SharePoint-hosted apps are ones that really have, I'd say, the appeal of them is that they're very kind of low friction deployment because they only use essentially the core capabilities of SharePoint. So you can host a lot but at the same time they're a little bit you don't have all the flexibility that you have with the Azure hosted apps. So what you can do is you can reuse all the web elements of SharePoint. So you can create HTML and JavaScript for the UI. But when those applications need to do some kind of server-side processing or run some kind of business rule, some kind of event-based logic, that's where you can use workflows to make those apps richer. So we think of generally where in the case of SharePoint-hosted apps, we think of workflow as the middle tier for those applications. So in addition to the HTML, JavaScript, where you have in your classic three-tier model where you have presentation, middle tier, and data. SharePoint is the place where you store all the data. The UI is HTML, JavaScript, and then we think of workflow as that middle tier logic. Now, if you're doing a cloud-hosted app where you really have the full power of a Azure environment for building applications, we see workflows there as also complementing those applications as a place where you can put business process and different kinds of business rules. So you're essentially augmenting that application with your own logic. Okay, let me show you a quick demo. So I have an app that I've built. This is a SharePoint app. I built it with Visual Studio. If I was I'm not gonna create a new one now, but actually I'll show you later, where you select the auto-hosted, SharePoint hosted app. So in this case, I have an app. It consists of basically HTML, JavaScript, and I've also have a workflow. Inside that workflow, it's basically a flow chart. So what this application is going to do is it's an event planner application, and I need a workflow to both create events in the calendar and then send reminders. And in this case, the reminders are going to run close to the event, and so that's where I want to use a workflow. And I'm also going to use a workflow to copy some data and make sure that as the events get approved, they get reflected in the calendar. So in this case, the workflow sends a confirmation email, and then it reads some properties from the item, creates a task for the user, and then if the task is approved, it's going to go ahead and create an item in the event calendar, and so on. So inside each one of these steps, I can do things like declare variables, and I can call some of the actions that we have in the palette for SharePoint, where we can go ahead and all the same kinds of actions that you have available in SharePoint Designer, you have available in Visual Studio. And then, so in this case, we're getting the current item GUID, and we're assigning that to a variable. And so we're constructing the logic of the workflow this way. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the app. Here's where I've launched into the Event Planner app. I'm going to go ahead and create a request. So I should have cleared my demo. Let me get rid of this. Okay, let's create a new item. So we're going to have a customer meeting, and we're going to say that our event planner is Alex. I'm going to set a due date of this Friday. Okay, so here we have a SharePoint app, and what I want is when I create that event request, I want a workflow to kick off, assign a task, and then when that task is approved, then create an item in the calendar. So I'm just going to show you a different navigation into workflow status. We see here, we can see that a workflow has been started, and this is inside the app. So you can see by the URL here that this is running inside the what we call the app isolation domain. So you can see this is a SharePoint app. So when I go into the status, we can see that it created a task. I'm just showing you a different navigation. So I'm going to go ahead and open that task. And the interesting thing with that task is that now the ID, it's not workflow. Right? It doesn't say workflow on behalf of Alex. I started the workflow as Alex, so in this case it's a little bit contrived that Alex would be assigning a task to himself. But in this case, what you see as what is the app principal that had created that task, it's the event planner. So before we had, in one case, where the app principal was workflow, which is the default app principal that we create. But in this case, because we're running as part of an app called the event planner, workflows are running with the security context of the event planner. And so when I install that app, and when you install an app, it asks you, do you trust that application? And the app requests certain set of permissions. Those are the kinds of, those are the capabilities that the app and workflow are requesting. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and edit the item and approve the task. And then when I go back to my event planner, if I look in the event calendar, we can see that now the workflow created an appointment for this Friday. So there you go. That was a workflow in an app. Okay, so now we've covered a lot of ground. So now let's just talk about a little bit about how you deploy this stuff and how you scale it, back to the question that we had earlier in the session. So I think I have two main models for how you deploy the Workflow Manager and SharePoint together. The one model is where you co-locate everything. So every node in SharePoint also has a deployment of Workflow Manager and all the associated components of the Workflow Manager. In this case, essentially, how you scale SharePoint is how you scale the Workflow Manager. They still are decoupled from each other. So the processing in Workflow Manager is separate from the processing of the web front end, but it basically gives you consistency across all the nodes. One thing that it's important to note is that because this is all using HTTP messaging, the communication between SharePoint and Workflow Manager goes through basically the front end, the load balancer, and that's how the two communicate with each other. Or I should say, there should be a load balancing layer between SharePoint and Workflow Manager. So it could either be the front end load balancer, or you need software load balancing between SharePoint in order to essentially achieve the scale out of the Workflow Manager. And the reason why we do this is that from the point of view of SharePoint, the address of the Workflow Manager is one logical host. And so the front end itself is stateless, and all the state is, the front end is stateless, the back ends are decoupled, and to make all the load balancing work, that's how you have to set it up. The other model that we have The other model is where you can federate this, and you can either federate it in one farm or multiple farms. So in this case, you can separate the workflow processing into its own farm or cluster and separate it from SharePoint. And this gives you the advantage that you can scale it separately from SharePoint, and you can also know exactly how much resources your workflow processing is consumed. So in this release, we recommend up to 3 nodes, maximum of 3 nodes of workflow. So for high availability and load balancing, we would recommend 3 nodes. We really don't see a need where you would have to go much higher than that. That should be more than enough processing power for even the largest of workflow scenarios. But the other thing that you can do is you can also share that workflow cluster with multiple SharePoint farms. Because the Workflow Manager has been designed from the ground up to be multi-tenant, you can actually take multiple SharePoint farms and configure them. We provide configuration commands, yes. The question is, can you control the number of instances? And the answer is no, you cannot. We don't provide a specific quota per farm for the number of instances, but there are, the Workflow Manager does have fairness, this notion of a fairness heuristics to ensure that across the different tenants, you can't have one tenant that consumes all the resources. So one point to note that when you deploy in this model, we still require the workflow client to be installed in the SharePoint nodes, and it has to be on all the nodes on the machine. And it's that workflow client that's just required for communication. So how do you install this? So the easiest way of installing it is using Workflow Manager is not a prerequisite for SharePoint. You actually have to download it, and you can download it either through the Web Platform Installer or directly from the Download Center. And in Web Platform Installer, if we have time, I'll just give a quick walkthrough. But basically, if you search for workflow, you'll see 3 things: Workflow Manager Client, and then the Workflow Manager tools for Visual Studio. So get Workflow Manager and Workflow Client. make sure the Workflow Manager client gets installed on every machine where SharePoint is. And then what you do is you run a SharePoint PowerShell command that we call the workflow pairing command. And that pairing command is register SP workflow service. And then you have to specify the SharePoint site of, any SharePoint site in SharePoint. It can be, typically the root site is what we use. And then you specify the workflow service host URI. So I have some notes here. So first, in production, it's absolutely required to use SSL and that's a requirement of the OAuth protocol. Essentially, you want to secure the tokens from network snooping. So SSL is really required in production, and it's the default. Now, if you just want to play around with it or test it in a dev environment, it is possible to configure it just using HTTP, and we have a command option to do that. But again, that's only really not recommended for production. Yes, question? So the question is it possible to have multiple workflow services? So, let me go back to this picture. So, what we support is going from multiple SharePoint farms to one workflow manager, but we don't have a model where we have multiple workflow managers to one farm. So one SharePoint farm is pointed to one workflow manager, but that workflow manager can be shared. And how you would share it is in the pairing command, we actually have a parameter, which I don't show in here, which is what we call the farm scope. So you would specify a different farm scope for each farm, and then that creates the multi-tenant partition inside the workflow manager. This is the only command that you really need. You run it once when you're doing the deployment, and then after that, you can forget about that command. So if you wanted to add another node to Workflow Manager, sorry, can you? Oh, you want to change the endpoint? Yeah, in that case, yeah, you would have to tear down the proxy and then rerun the same command. And you probably would want to. You could run the same command with a different address and use the force parameter, and then that'll override all the settings. Okay, so we're out of time. So just to summarize, so we talked about how we saw all the new expressive capabilities with the flow control, stages, calling web services, Visual Designer. Talked about how we've made workflows a full member of the app model in terms of authorization, use of web services, REST, and OAuth protocol. And we saw how the new Workflow Manager lets us essentially, through the decoupled architecture, scale and manage independently and use all the latest and greatest workflow technology from Microsoft. Just wanted to plug in a few related sessions. So if you want to learn more about how to write SharePoint apps that use workflows for the middle tier, go to Tim McConnell's sessions later today. HG Kim is going to go into how you write your own custom actions for SharePoint Designer, and that's pretty cool. So you can create your own reusable actions that you can then compose into workflows. And then lastly, Sam Chung and Jonghwa Lim are going to talk about how you create workflows in SharePoint Designer. They're going to talk about how you do Visio integration, and they're going to go into a lot more detail in terms of how you construct those web services expressions. So I want to thank everyone for coming out.